The year was 1453, and Constantinople had fallen. Smoke curled through the streets, rising from shattered rooftops and the broken stones of the city walls. Hours earlier, the sound of cannon fire had shaken the earth, but now a different sound filled the air, the measured tramp of boots, steady and inevitable, pressing deeper into the heart of the Byzantine capital. A young woman stood in the shadow of her doorway, clutching her infant son to her chest. Her husband was gone, slain on the walls, one defender among thousands who had given their lives for a city that could not be saved. His last words still echoed in her mind. "Stay with the child. If the city falls, pray." She had prayed. She had whispered psalms until her throat was raw, but her prayers could not keep the enemy from breaching the gates, nor could they bring her husband back to her. Now only silence and smoke remained. Around her, the neighborhood she once knew was transformed. The aroma of bread and chestnuts from the marketplace had been replaced by the bitter sting of ash. Shops stood looted, shutters torn from their hinges, a cross toppled in the dust. Somewhere not far away, she could hear the crash of a door being broken, a child's cry swallowed by harsh voices speaking in a tongue she did not know. She pressed her back harder against the wall, trying to vanish into the stone. Her son whimpered, and she rocked him gently, whispering desperate comforts she herself did not believe. The cross above her doorway caught the glow of a nearby fire. Once it had been her shield, a sign of protection. Now it felt like a mark that would betray her. She touched it with trembling fingers, whispering a prayer not for herself, but for the child she held. The sound of the soldiers grew nearer. Their voices were sharp, commanding, laced with laughter. She could picture them in her mind. Lines of men in armor, blades still red from battle, their eyes searching every shadow for plunder, for captives, for the spoils of conquest. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it would give her away. Memories flickered before her eyes. Her wedding day, the bells of Hagia Sophia ringing in joy, her husband's nervous smile as he swore to protect her. Their first nights in this little home. The birth of their son. How safe the city had seemed then, eternal behind its walls. How fragile it seemed now, reduced to dust and ruin in a single day. She thought of escape, but there was nowhere left to run. The sea was blocked, the gates in enemy hands, the streets crawling with soldiers. She thought of death, but her son stirred, his tiny fingers curling around her robe, and she knew that death was not hers to choose. She thought of God, but heaven was silent. And so she stood frozen, between hope and despair, caught in the narrow space of a single moment, listening as the conquerors came closer. History remembers the fall of Constantinople as the triumph of one empire and the death of another. Chroniclers wrote of cannons and sultans, treaties and legacies. But in that street, history was nothing more than a widow clutching her child, her husband's blood still fresh in her memory, as the footsteps of soldiers drew near. The fall of the city was not followed by the blind chaos one might expect. There was looting, yes, and fire in the streets, but beneath the smoke lay a colder truth. What followed was not simply violence, but procedure. The conquerors came armed not only with swords and cannons, but with a system. To the terrified eyes of those captured, it might have looked like madness: men dragged from their homes, women herded into courtyards, children torn from their mothers' arms. But behind the shouting and the iron grip of soldiers, there was an order, a design that had been honed over countless campaigns. The Ottomans did not leave conquest to chance. They harvested. Each street became a channel, directing the flow of captives like water into pools where they could be measured, judged, and divided. The living were counted with the same precision one might use for livestock or grain. An officer with a ledger walked among the prisoners, his pen working as steadily as a soldier's blade. Names, ages, origins, where possible, they were recorded. When not, a mark or number was enough. This was not rage, not the fever of an army drunk on victory. It was bureaucracy. A system born of empire, designed to transform human suffering into profit and power. Men were stripped of weapons, stripped of pride, stripped of future. Women were not seen as wives, mothers, or daughters, but as potential assets. Children were seized, their cries muffled by the crack of orders, their fate already mapped out by rules that had existed long before the city's walls were breached. It was this machine-like precision that made the conquest so devastating. No life was left untouched, no soul allowed to slip through the cracks. Where chaos might have left room for escape, for mercy, for chance, the protocol closed every path. Every person belonged somewhere, in chains, in ledgers, in markets, in camps. The city itself, still smoldering from the cannon fire, became a kind of workshop, processing the defeated into categories that would serve the empire. To stand in those crowds was to feel less than human. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers in languages the soldiers ignored. The old sank to their knees, too weary to beg. And above it all moved the quiet figures with their papers and ink, turning flesh and blood into numbers on a page. This was conquest, not as fury, but as policy. And to the conquered that made it all the more terrifying. The system was merciless in its clarity. The first to be dealt with were the men, fathers, sons, brothers, the same men who only hours before had defended the walls with trembling hands and desperate prayers. Now, disarmed and bound, they were marked not as captives, but as obstacles. Adult males and older boys, any who bore the shape of a fighter, were separated from the crowd. There was no ledger for them, no calculation of worth. Their value was in their absence, in the silence their deaths would bring. One by one, they were led away. Some fought even then, lunging forward with fists, shouting defiance in the name of a city already lost. Others dropped to their knees, clutching the robes of soldiers, begging for mercy that never came. A few simply stared, hollow-eyed, as if their souls had already departed before the blade touched their throats. For the women left behind, there was no comfort in survival. The soldiers turned to them next, and here the order grew colder, sharper, more exact. Mothers clutched daughters in trembling arms, but separation was inevitable. The conquerors sorted them with practiced eyes, the way merchants judge silks or gemstones. Age was the first measure. Youth was prized, beauty even more so. Girls on the edge of womanhood were pulled forward, their faces inspected, their bodies appraised. Notes were taken. Numbers assigned. Women between 14 and 25 were set apart, marked as the most valuable. Soldiers moved among them with a disturbing calm, pushing hair back from faces, examining teeth, treating them not as human beings but as stock to be evaluated. A girl's terror might raise or lower her price. Her defiance might doom her entirely. Those between 25 and 40 were treated differently. They were still considered useful, but not in the same way. Their beauty was deemed to have dimmed, their worth measured more in strength of body than in the curve of cheek or brightness of eyes. These women were set aside for labor, destined to serve not as prizes but as tools. And for those over 40, the future was often bleakest of all. Many were deemed burdens, their bodies too old to command a price, their voices too sharp to silence. Some were executed outright, their lives ending quietly on the margins while the process continued. Others were left to linger in despair, cast into roles so diminished they no longer resembled life. The children, watching with wide eyes, saw their world divided in moments. Sons old enough to hold a sword were ripped from their mothers, never to return. Daughters too young to understand were still marked, their futures already claimed by hands that held ink-stained ledgers and unsheathed steel. What unfolded in those courtyards was not the frenzy of conquest but the theater of classification. To the Ottomans, it was order. To the conquered, it was the death of humanity itself, families torn apart with the same indifference one might show in separating grain from chaff. The young women were the ones most coveted. Those between 14 and 25 were judged to be the most valuable, not for their humanity, but for what they could be made to represent. Soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their eyes appraising, their hands too careful in their touch, as though they were deciding the worth of fine porcelain or delicate jewelry. Each young woman was given a number, a score, as if her life could be distilled to a mere calculation. Her face, her eyes, her figure, all were measured in the cruelest of terms. What could she offer? Could she bear children? Would her beauty fade too soon? How much could she fetch in the slave markets? It was not only youth that determined her worth, but beauty, the kind that could be sold, used, and traded. Those deemed the most exquisite were whisked away, their fates sealed not by love, not by any choice of their own, but by the cold judgment of men who saw nothing of them but assets. To be young, to be beautiful, was to be treasured. To be marked by this brutal system was to be both prized and imprisoned, a symbol of victory for the invaders but a shattered dream for the women themselves. The older women, those between 25 and 40, were deemed less valuable, their faces no longer as soft, their bodies no longer as desirable. But they were not dismissed entirely. They were put to other tasks, pressed into labor, assigned roles that drained their vitality, bending them into the shape of servitude. They were no longer wives or daughters, but hands to do the work of the soldiers, to clean, to cook, to carry water. These women would never see their families again, never hold their children, never know the softness of peace. Instead, they would work until their bones broke under the weight of their captors' commands. And then there were those over 40, the oldest women. For them, there was no value left. Their beauty had long faded, their strength was spent, and their role in this new world had been reduced to nothingness. Many were executed outright, left in alleys or cast into shallow graves where no one would remember their names. They had passed the point of usefulness, and in the eyes of the conquerors, they were discarded. What had been once a world full of mothers and daughters, full of family and life, had now become a ledger of values, a system of worth that knew no love, no mercy. The city's fall was not only the end of a kingdom, it was the systematic erasure of what it had been, replacing its vibrance with a cold, calculated machine. And the women, sorted and judged, stood in the center of it all, powerless, silent, their futures weighed in numbers. Among the captives, it was the young women, those between 14 and 25, who held the most value. Their faces were the blank canvases upon which future horrors could be painted, and their bodies, still full of promise, were seen as assets. For the youngest of the captives, there was a fate that was darker still. Girls under 12 were not simply taken, they were trained. The invaders spoke in cold terms, their words as clinical as a surgeon's blade. These girls were put into formation programs, where their innocence would be stripped away, and their identities reshaped for a purpose that belonged entirely to the empire. They were given new names, new identities, and their childhoods were erased, swept aside by the grinding wheels of conquest. These children, once playing in the streets of Constantinople, now found themselves shoved into cold, sterile rooms where they were trained not to be girls but to be something else, something designed to serve. The lessons they learned were not of joy, but of obedience. They were groomed for future roles, to become commodities to be traded, sold, or used as soldiers' spoils. Their laughter was silenced, their spirits broken, as the days turned to months and the months to years. These children would never again know a home, never again know the warmth of a mother's embrace. Instead, they were taught to submit to the will of their captors, to become tools of a system that saw them as nothing more than objects for future profit and control. For the other women, those not young enough to be formed, the future was no less grim. Many were sold into slavery, their names erased and their bodies marked for sale. The slave markets were filled with women and children, processed with chilling efficiency. Their faces, their names, their histories no longer mattered. What mattered was their value, their condition, their ability to serve. They were sold to the highest bidder, passed from one hand to another, their lives no longer their own. Others were distributed among the soldiers, who took their pick with the same coldness they would show when selecting horses or supplies. The soldiers' eyes were sharp, scanning each woman and girl as though they were livestock, inspecting them for qualities that could serve their own needs, for pleasure, for labor, or for use in some other grim capacity. These women, now nothing but spoils of war, were dispersed across the empire, becoming parts of the machine that had conquered their lives. And all the while, records were kept meticulously. Each captive, each woman, each child was logged, catalogued, and numbered, as if they were no more than items in an inventory. The conquerors moved through the city like bureaucrats in a warehouse, processing human lives as though they were no different from the goods they had looted. There was no chaos, no sense of loss, only the cold efficiency of an empire that knew exactly how to strip people of everything that made them human. The brutality of conquest was not only in the violence, but in the cold calculation that followed. The Ottomans did not leave human lives to the whims of chaos. Instead, they formalized the business of human trafficking. The process became an economy, systematic, organized, and profitable. Human lives were catalogued and priced, not by their worth as individuals, but by what they could bring to the empire. Cargo, that's what they were called. Not women. Not children. But cargo. They were listed alongside goods on manifests, their names written down like any other item that could be traded, bought, and sold. It was not a private act of violence, but a public, legal procedure. The women who had once been free were now marked. They were no longer allowed to be who they had been. Their names were changed, their faiths abandoned, and their very identities swallowed up by the empire that had conquered them. They became symbols of victory, living reminders of the empire's dominance, no longer themselves, but whatever the empire required them to be. The aftermath of the conquest didn't simply end with the taking of Constantinople. The city fell, but the scars it left ran deep into the fabric of its people, into the very structure of its society. The Ottomans didn't just conquer the city, they remade it, reshaping not only its buildings and streets but the lives of those who remained. For the survivors, the terror didn't cease with the end of battle. It lingered, hanging in the air like smoke from the burning city. The communities that once flourished within the walls of Constantinople now lived under a constant shadow. Raids were no longer random acts of war, but part of a sustained strategy, a permanent threat to the people. They never knew when the next strike would come, when soldiers would burst into their homes, drag their sons and daughters into the streets, or break their doors down in search of more captives to add to their inventories. These raids were not isolated events, they were the rhythm of life under the empire's new rule, an ongoing reminder of the Ottomans' power, of their ability to take what they wanted, when they wanted it. The people of Constantinople learned to live with fear. They learned to look over their shoulders at every moment, to listen for the distant sound of approaching boots. To sleep was to risk losing everything, their families, their futures, their very identities. And so, life was fractured, lived in the shadow of terror. But the Ottomans were nothing if not efficient, and they did not simply rely on fear to control the people. They built systems designed not just to hold, but to break, reshape, and control. The city was transformed into a prison, not through walls of stone, but through architecture designed to strip its inhabitants of their humanity. The very design of the city, the layout of the streets, the placement of buildings, the construction of imposing, impassable walls, became a tool of subjugation.